The courtroom was electric with tension. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. Everyone was waiting for the verdict, but no one could have predicted what was about to happen. Yarnell Beatty, the attorney for the State Medical Board, had just finished deposing me. His next target was Dr. Brookoff, a respected physician who had been treating my patients. Beatty's eyes narrowed as he began his questioning, clearly expecting a straightforward condemnation. But what he got was far from what he anticipated. "Dr. Brookoff, do you have any disagreements with the way Dr. Nishapoulos used narcotic medications to treat some of the patients you are currently seeing on his behalf?" Beatty asked, his voice dripping with anticipation. To everyone's surprise, Dr. Brookoff nodded. "Yes, I do," he replied calmly. Beatty's eyebrows shot up. "Could you elaborate on that, Dr. Brookoff?" Dr. Brookoff took a deep breath. "I believe Dr. Nishapoulos did not give his patients enough medication. In some cases, their doses needed to be increased. For example, Mrs. Kramer was given codeine for her pain, but when I saw her, I felt she needed morphine. After she took it, she came back the following week and returned the medication, saying it was too strong. So I prescribed a weaker painkiller." The room was silent, the gravity of Dr. Brookoff's words sinking in. It was clear that this was not the testimony the state had hoped for. A few weeks later, I found myself in Nashville, facing the medical board. My longtime friend and attorney, Robert Green, had recommended Dan Warlick to represent me. Warlick was a sharp lawyer, known for his professionalism and decisiveness. We had met years ago when he was the chief investigator in the tragic death of Elvis Presley at Graceland. Since then, Warlick had moved to Nashville and become a medical malpractice attorney, but he still had clients in Memphis. He took my case without hesitation, quickly assembling a team of 25 witnesses and estimating the defense would take 6 days to present. The hearings began in a routine manner. For 3 days, the proceedings were uneventful, with only 3 witnesses testifying. But on the 4th day, everything changed. Warlick had a different approach in mind, especially when it came to the state's key witness, Dr. Roland W. Gray. Dr. Gray was a pediatrician with a long history of service to the Tennessee Medical Board. He was known for reviewing cases involving the prescription of narcotic medications, and often testified that the medications were prescribed in addictive quantities. This alone was usually enough to win the case for the prosecution, resulting in the physician's license being revoked or a costly retraining program. Warlick started his cross-examination with a simple question. "Dr. Gray, is there any indication in the record that the patient you reviewed was taking the medication for any reason other than pain?" "No," Dr. Gray replied, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "Is there any indication that the patient was taking the medication for a euphoric effect?" Again, Dr. Gray shook his head. "No." Warlick's questions grew more pointed. "Did you assume that most of the drug notations in the patient's records were prescriptions written by Dr. Nishapoulos? Or could they have been from the dozens of specialists to whom he referred his patients?" Dr. Gray hesitated. "I assumed they were Dr. Nishapoulos' prescriptions." Warlick pressed on. "Do you agree that patients can build up a tolerance to drugs and often need increasing doses to manage their pain?" Dr. Gray nodded. "Yes, that's true." Warlick's next question was like a punch to the gut. "Dr. Gray, what is your current title at the treatment center you are affiliated with?" Dr. Gray's face turned red. "I don't actually have a title there." "Are you on the medical staff at the facility?" "No," Dr. Gray admitted. "Are you the medical director for the organization?" "No," he mumbled. Warlick leaned forward, his voice steady and resolute. "Then, Dr. McCallum, I move that Dr. Gray be disqualified as an expert witness." The room fell silent. Dr. Oscar McCallum, the board president, glared at Warlick. "I've been through this kind of manipulation before. Dr. Gray has been a fine expert witness for the board for many years. We're not about to disqualify him just because you say so." The administrative judge, sensing the tension, interjected. "Mr. Warlick does raise a legitimate concern, Dr. McCallum." McCallum's face turned even redder. "We don't need expert testimony to make our judgments. We are the medical board of the state of Tennessee, and we are the experts. We don't need to be questioned by anyone, especially not by you." Warlick bowed slightly. "I meant no disrespect, Dr. McCallum, but I would like permission to voir dire the board to establish their level of expertise in this field." McCallum's eyes narrowed. "No, you can't do that. This is the medical board, and we are the final authority." The judge, looking uncomfortable, shook his head. "I don't know if this has ever come up before." McCallum's voice was firm. "We are the medical board, and we are the judges. This is final." Warlick nodded, but the damage was done. The board had just handed Warlick grounds for a potential appeal that could upset rulings going back years. The proceedings continued, dragging on for nearly a year. By the time they concluded, the list of patients in question had been reduced to one, Jerry Lee Lewis. The board found that I had violated federal law in my treatment of Jerry Lee Lewis and decided to revoke my medical license in Tennessee, but the real battle was far from over. Warlick was already preparing an appeal, challenging the state's so-called expert and the board's decision. In the meantime, I was allowed to continue practicing medicine, but I could only prescribe Schedule 5 medications, which had a low risk of addiction. This meant I had to constantly find other doctors to treat my most critical patients, who were still suffering under the cloud of the Elvis Presley controversy. Dr. Marijan studied the bioscience laboratory report carefully. He pointed out that the report mentioned diazepam, a drug commonly known as Valium. The report didn't specify which diazepam metabolite was found, but it could be either oxazepam or nordiazepam. These metabolites are what the body produces when it breaks down diazepam. Dr. Marijan explained that if he knew exactly which metabolite was detected, and at what concentration, he could estimate how much Valium the person had taken and when. In Elvis's case, the report showed a very small amount of diazepam, only 0.01 mcg/ml. For an overdose, the concentration would need to be much higher, around 30 mcg/ml. This suggested that Elvis had taken Valium, but not in a fatal dose. The small amount of metabolite also indicated that the drug had been taken a while before the specimen was collected, possibly about 12 hours earlier. Next, Dr. Marijan talked about ethchlorovinol, a sedative from the 1950s and 1960s. The report showed a concentration of 7.5 mcg/ml in Elvis's blood. For a fatal case, the concentration would typically be around 84 mcg/ml. Again, this was far too low to be a cause of death. Amibarbital, a short-acting barbiturate, was also found in Elvis's system. The report showed a concentration of 11 mcg/ml, which is about 1/10 of the amount that would be considered fatal. Phenobarbital, another barbiturate, was present at 5 mcg/ml, a concentration that wouldn't even cause drowsiness. Methaqualone, commonly known as Quaaludes, was another drug found in Elvis's system. The report showed a concentration of 6.0 mcg/ml, which is close to the low end of what might be found in a fatal case. However, the report did not quantify the drug in Elvis's tissues, which is important for a complete assessment. Dr. Marijan concluded that the amount of methaqualone found was not enough to cause death. Dr. Marijan also noted that Demerol, a painkiller, was found in Elvis's liver and kidneys, but no blood concentrations were measured. He emphasized that while many drugs and metabolites were identified in Elvis's body, none of them were present in high enough concentrations to be a clear cause of death. Dr. Marijan strongly disagreed with the conclusion that Elvis's death was due to multiple drug ingestion. He believed that the media and some medical professionals were trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. He pointed out that the typical way someone dies from sedatives or narcotics is by falling asleep and stopping breathing. If Elvis was alert or awake when he died, it couldn't have been from an overdose. The Baptist Memorial pathologists, the media, and the public didn't agree with Dr. Marijan's interpretation. The media, in particular, was invested in the idea that Elvis died from a drug overdose, and they weren't interested in hearing a different story. The state sealed the report, and the official narrative remained that Elvis died from drug-related causes. Years later, Dr. Dwight Reed, one of the consultants for the bioscience laboratory report, admitted that the polypharmacy ruling was just an opinion, not a medical certainty. Despite this, the media and the public continued to believe the overdose theory. Dr. Nishapoulos, who had treated Elvis, faced his own legal battles. He received a letter offering to settle his case, but it required him to admit to all the allegations, which he refused to do. The Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners eventually revoked his medical license. Dr. Nishapoulos appealed the decision, but the board denied his application to practice medicine again. During this time, Dr. Nishapoulos worked as a road manager for Jerry Lee Lewis. a job that provided some income and a connection to the medical field. He continued to research and explore different ways to treat chronic pain, but without a medical license, his options were limited. Despite the challenges, Dr. Nishapoulos remained determined to find a way to contribute to the medical community. Some 15 years after losing my license, I still talk to Dr. Dan Brookhoff about what I could have done differently to keep Elvis's image and my medical license from falling into disrepute. It's a thought that crosses my mind every single day. I guess I should have listened to other doctors early on, I told Dr. Brookhoff. They said, you need to treat all your patients' symptoms the same way, regardless of their personal case. I had to treat each individual's needs. I couldn't treat people like they were following a recipe in a cookbook. That's the art of being a doctor, Dr. Brookhoff said. And that's what you were, Dr. Nick Elvis's doctor. You tried to help your patients live the best life they could. This was Elvis's life, a weird life, but the one he chose, which was extraordinary, and he needed an extraordinary doctor. Dr. Brookhoff's kind words helped, but his sentiment meant even more. I believe I am finally at peace with my life and my journey through the unpredictable world of rock and roll with one of the greatest entertainers of our time. I no longer obsess about what I might have contributed to my chosen profession if I had been allowed to continue treating patients. In a flash, I can see thousands of cheering faces, my own included, capturing the memory of a lifetime in Elvis's world, the drama, the passion, the music, the love, the exact moment when Elvis burst onto the stage. That was the moment I knew I was a part of the dream that made his life worth living right up to the end. That's what I focus on each day, the gift given, not the price paid. On June 26, 1977, Elvis gave his final concert in Indianapolis, Indiana. It was a bittersweet moment, not knowing it would be the last time we'd see him perform. 3 weeks after my manuscript met its deadline, my cell phone woke me from an afternoon nap. It was my writer. "Are you watching TV?" he asked. "Which channel?" I replied, glancing at the blank screen in front of me. "Anyone will do. It's breaking news. I'm on CNN," he said. We quickly tuned in and watched in silence along with millions of other viewers as the shocking news unfolded. The date was June 25, 2009. I looked at my wristwatch, 2:27 p.m. CST. My body shifted into an eerie space, taking me back to the worst day of my life. The scene, an ambulance leaving the gates of an elite residence, heading to a nearby hospital in a desperate attempt to save a patient who was not breathing. Some reports said a doctor was in the ambulance with the patient. Paparazzi noticed no efforts to revive the patient, starting rumors that the famous passenger was already dead. Before the press conference made the announcement official, comparisons were already being made to a similar scenario from a different time. The two subjects were, after all, music's two kings, the king of rock and roll and the king of pop. In 1977, celebrity news was in its infancy. There were no cable channels battling networks for scoops, no internet spreading the word lightning fast, and no citizen journalists, whose opinions found eager messengers to carry their insights around the world. The big dilemma back then had been whether evening newscasts should lead with the news of Elvis's death. In 2009, the scenes were broadcast in real time, and by nightfall, talk shows were already discussing Michael Jackson's life, his accomplishments, and the manner of his death. For weeks, I couldn't answer my home phone. Callers left messages asking to talk to Elvis's doctor personally. They wanted my opinion on the similarities between the deaths of two of the most famous entertainers of our lifetime. There is none. These are two different scenarios, two different situations. Dr. Kevin Merrigan confirmed when my writer and I dropped by his office one afternoon. Dr. Merrigan, a clinical pharmacologist and toxicologist, had worked at the Elvis Presley Trauma Center in 1994. Now he runs a clinic called the Stone Institute in Cordova, Tennessee. I had a copy of a CNN article. Michael Jackson's death was a homicide, coroner ruled. The press release from the Los Angeles County coroner stated that propofol and lorazepam were the primary drugs responsible for Jackson's death. Other drugs found in his system included midazolam, diazepam, lidocaine, and ephedrine. Jackson died from acute propofol intoxication and benzodiazepine effect. Dr. Murray, Jackson's doctor, told detectives he had treated Jackson for insomnia for about 6 weeks. He tried to wean Jackson off the drugs, but eventually gave him a combination of anti-anxiety drugs before administering propofol via an intravenous drip. He stepped out of the room for a few minutes, and when he returned, Jackson had stopped breathing and did not respond to CPR. Paramedics were unable to revive him. The crux of the matter was that propofol is a dangerous anesthetic agent that should only be used in a hospital by a licensed anesthesiologist. Dr. Murray, a cardiologist, faced criticism and questions about his ability and judgment. There were rumors that he might be criminally liable for Jackson's death. "It's hard to believe he'd take something like that," Dr. Marijan said, referring to Jackson. "I've seen that drug used in the emergency room. It can cause respiratory depression and low blood pressure in people given small doses. In very small levels, it can shut down your brain. It's an induction agent for general anesthesia. That's not like anything Elvis was on. I remembered my own efforts to help Elvis get a full night's sleep. I had tried everything to help him conquer his lifelong battle with insomnia, which I felt affected his other medical problems. I had exhausted every option I knew." Dr. Marijan discussed modern options for treating insomnia. "If you're going to use an induction agent, why not use an inhalation anesthesia?" he asked, half-joking. "You can just knock people down with ether, but there are inhalation agents that do what propofol does. There's an approved drug called Xyrem, which you can use for insomnia, and it's an anesthesia agent in pill form. I have some patients on it, and it works well. It knocks you out, but it lasts only 4 hours. Patients wake up and need to redose. That's how most insomniacs sleep. They get a few hours of sleep and then wake up." I recalled how some people around Elvis scoffed when he asked for an additional nightly packet to redose for his insomnia. They claimed his actions were evidence of drug addiction, but that was before sleep aids like Lunesta and Ambien became available. "Probably at least 35% of the people I see have insomnia," Dr. Marijan said, "and not all for the same reason. Insomnia is common among night shift workers, veterans, and people with demanding jobs. The more fatigue they get, the more insomnia they have. What causes it? Nobody knows," Dr. Marijan sighed. We then discussed Elvis's leaked autopsy report, and the case dissenters made regarding what they claimed was death by polypharmacy, trying to hold me responsible. Dr. Marijan reviewed the bioscience laboratory toxicology report of drug levels found in Elvis's body. "There's nothing here to substantiate a drug overdose to any degree of certainty. There's nothing that jumps out and says, 'Oh my gosh, he's odd,'" he said. "Back then, there were only a handful of drugs you could use to help someone sleep, and any patient gets tolerant to any medication used nightly. So I understand why there are several drugs listed in the results," I explained. The Baptist pathologists claimed Elvis's death was due to polypharmacy because of the combination of drugs and the level of depressants in his system. They didn't take into account that the drugs involved didn't affect the brain in the same way. I said, "That's true. Each individual drug has a different effect on the brain." Dr. Marijan agreed. "The idea of synergy or amplification of two separate drugs on the brain is more of a theory than a proven fact. There's no scientific data to support it. If you take alcohol and Valium together, they act differently. Alcohol changes chloride ion movement in the brain, making you loopy. Valium binds to benzodiazepine receptors and affects brain function through receptor-mediated ion conductance change. They don't amplify each other's effects." Elvis was on those medicines for some time. He had built up a tolerance to them. That's why there were so many drugs in such small amounts in his system. None of the medications were working, so he probably rotated them or stopped taking them, I explained. "We were giving him phenobarbital, a long-acting barbiturate, to prevent seizures. He had a serious seizure once in St. Louis, and we found him alone in his hotel room, almost dead," I said. Dr. Marijan understood. "You can become resensitized to a drug if you take a break from it. If you switch between different classes of drugs, like barbiturates and benzodiazepines, it can work. That's why he had such small amounts of those drugs in his system. You were trying to help him manage his insomnia and other issues by rotating his medications. I kept changing his medicines after a few months, thinking I could come back to them later when he was sensitive to them again," I explained. Dr. Marijan nodded. "That's a good approach. It's a complex issue, and you were doing your best to help an extraordinary patient in extraordinary circumstances." Dr. Marijan and I sat in his office. the afternoon sun casting a warm glow through the window. We were discussing the infamous case of Elvis Presley, a man whose life and death had been shrouded in mystery and controversy. The topic of drug overdose often came up, especially with the amount of medication found in Elvis's system at the time of his death. People often assumed the worst, labeling him a drug addict without fully understanding the science behind tolerance and its effects on the body. People are shocked when they see someone taking a lot of pills and not dying. I said, they just assume the person is a drug addict. But when a patient becomes tolerant to a medication, their brain receptors shut down. The medicine can't reach the parts it needs to, so it stops working. It doesn't make them high. It just makes them sick or even toxic. That's why doctors try to avoid prescribing medications for a long time to prevent this tolerance from building up. Dr. Marijan nodded in agreement. That's exactly right. You have to look at the whole picture, not just the raw numbers. The levels of drugs in the body can mean different things depending on the context. It's not just about the quantity, it's about how the body is reacting to those drugs. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. If 10 doctors sat around a table and looked at Elvis's clinical data, they'd all come up with different scenarios. But one thing is clear, the data doesn't point to a drug overdose. If Elvis had all that medicine in his system and was symptomatic, he wouldn't have been able to even get to the bathroom. We both fell silent for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between us. I then brought up the Valsalva maneuver, a technique that involves straining and holding one's breath, which can affect heart rate and blood pressure. Elvis might have strained, causing his heart rate to slow down. When his heart tried to compensate by speeding up, it overcompensated, causing an arrhythmia and his blood pressure to drop. He could have lost consciousness, I suggested. It's possible, Dr. Marijan replied. But if he passed out, he probably would have regained consciousness. I think he had a heart arrhythmia for some reason. I've seen people die from arrhythmias in the ER, and it's not unusual. The carpet fibers in his mouth suggest he was struggling to breathe. If he had a drug overdose, he wouldn't have been able to breathe with such force. I nodded, understanding the clinical perspective. What about a seizure? Could that have caused his death? He could have had a seizure, especially if he was going through withdrawal. Seizures don't usually cause immediate death. The heart keeps beating. But if he seized and went into cardiac arrest, that's a different story. People in barbiturate withdrawal can die if untreated. Withdrawal is more likely than an overdose, especially if he had built up a tolerance. We talked about the media's role in perpetuating the idea of a drug overdose, how it captivated the public's imagination. Dr. Marijan was frustrated by this narrative. There's something sinister about this idea of a drug overdose. It's been used to tarnish Elvis's legacy and attack those around him, like Dr. Nick. But the autopsy and toxicology reports don't support that. Elvis didn't die from an overdose. The conversation shifted to the impact of the allegations on Dr. Nick, Elvis's personal physician. Dr. Nick did his best to help Elvis. He was investigated thoroughly, and there was no evidence of wrongdoing. But the media and some people with their own agendas destroyed his career. Elvis was a good guy, and he did a lot of good for Memphis. It's unfair how he's been labeled and judged after his death. Dr. Marijan's words were a mix of frustration and compassion. People can accuse you of anything in America, and the media will run with it. It's a vicious cycle. But the reality is, you do the best you can with what you have. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. That's just the way it is. As the afternoon wore on, we continued to discuss the nature of celebrity and the sacrifices it demands. People often judge celebrities based on isolated moments, without understanding the full context of their lives. There's a lot of evil out there, and people will do ugly things for their own gain, but you have to keep moving forward and do what you believe is right. The conversation ended with a sense of closure and understanding. We both knew that the truth about Elvis's death was complex and multifaceted, and that the public's perception was often skewed by misinformation and sensationalism. But for those who knew the real Elvis, the legacy of a good man remained intact. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, has been the subject of countless books, interviews, and articles. His life, music, and untimely death have captivated millions of fans around the world. Let's dive into the stories and insights that have shaped our understanding of Elvis and the people who knew him best. Elvis's life was chronicled by many who were close to him. Elaine Dundee wrote Elvis and Gladys, which explored the early life of Elvis and his mother. Joe Esposito, one of Elvis's longtime bodyguards, shared his memories in several books, including Good Rockin' Tonight and Elvis Straight Up. These books give us a glimpse into Elvis's personal life and the challenges he faced. Albert Goldman's Elvis is a detailed and sometimes controversial look at the King's life, while Peter Guralnick's two-volume biography, Last Train to Memphis and Careless Love, is widely regarded as one of the most comprehensive and balanced accounts of Elvis's rise and fall. Charlie Hodge, a close friend of Elvis, wrote Me and Elvis, sharing his first-hand experiences and memories. Priscilla Presley, Elvis's ex-wife, penned Elvis and Me, offering a personal and intimate look at their relationship. Other books, like The Elvis Conspiracy, by Dick Grob, delve into the more speculative and conspiracy theories surrounding Elvis's death. Interviews with those who knew Elvis personally provide deeper insights. Dr. George Nishapoulos, Elvis's personal physician, was interviewed multiple times by Rose Clayton and others. These interviews shed light on Elvis's health issues and the controversial prescription practices of the time. Joe Esposito, who was with Elvis until the end, also shared his thoughts in numerous telephone conversations. Dr. Jerry Francisco, another of Elvis's doctors, and Dr. Dan Brookhoff, a forensic psychiatrist, provided valuable perspectives on Elvis's health and the circumstances surrounding his death. Nancy Rooks, Elvis's former maid, and other staff members at Graceland, like Betty Carter, also shared their memories and experiences. Letters and legal documents offer a more formal and sometimes chilling look at the events leading up to and following Elvis's death. Dr. Nishapoulos's letters to other medical professionals and legal documents from his trials reveal the complex legal battles he faced. The Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners proceedings and the criminal court indictment provide a detailed account of the charges against Dr. Nishapoulos and the evidence presented. Articles from newspapers like the Memphis Press, Scimitar, and the Commercial Appeal captured the public's reaction to Elvis's death and the subsequent investigation. These articles highlight the shock and grief felt by fans and the community. Interviews with journalists and authors who covered Elvis's life and death provide additional context and analysis. Documentaries and television specials, such as Elvis on Tour and Elvis, That's the Way It Is, offer visual and auditory insights into Elvis's performances and personal life. These productions capture the energy and charisma that made Elvis a cultural icon. Through these books, interviews, letters, legal documents, articles, and media, we can piece together a more complete picture of Elvis Presley's life and legacy. Each source provides a unique perspective, helping us understand the man behind the legend and the impact he had on the world of music and popular culture. Dr. George Nishapoulos, known as Dr. Nick to his friends and patients, had a life that was as colorful and complex as the patients he treated. Born in a small town in Pennsylvania, he grew up in Alabama, the son of Greek immigrants. After serving in the Army Medical Corps in Germany, he pursued his education, earning degrees from the University of the South and Vanderbilt University. His medical career was marked by groundbreaking achievements, including the development of the first artificial kidney in the South, which brought hope to many suffering from renal failure. In 1967, Dr. Nishapoulos's life took a dramatic turn when he became the personal physician to Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. The two men formed a close bond, and Dr. Nick often accompanied Elvis on his tours, ensuring the singer's health and well-being. However, the intense scrutiny and pressure of fame took a toll on both men. Despite their friendship, Dr. Nishapoulos faced serious accusations of overprescribing controlled substances, which led to the revocation of his medical license in 1995. His appeals for reinstatement were denied, and he was forced to find new ways to contribute to the medical field as a consultant. Dr. Nishapoulos's story is not just about his medical accomplishments or his relationship with Elvis. It's also about the challenges and complexities of a life lived in the public eye. Despite the controversies, Dr. Nick remained a dedicated family man. He and his wife, Edna, raised 3 children in Memphis, Tennessee, and their family continues to be a source of pride and joy. Today, Dr. Nishapoulos is remembered not only for his medical contributions, but also for his role in the life of one of the most iconic figures in American music. Rose Clayton Phillips, a lifelong Memphian, has a unique perspective on Dr. Nishapoulos' life and career. Her father, Bill McAfee, was a newsreel cameraman who captured some of the earliest footage of Elvis Presley's rise to fame. Rose witnessed many of Elvis's pivotal moments firsthand, even traveling with him on his final tour. As a journalist and writer, she has chronicled the complex relationships and events surrounding the king of rock and roll, including the legal battles involving the Elvis Presley estate and Dr. Nishapoulos. Elvis Presley's legacy lives on in Memphis, where his music continues to inspire generations. On Beale Street, a world-famous center for blues and rock and roll, a music note pays tribute to the king. Dr. George Nishapoulos' life, intertwined with Elvis's, is a testament to the power of friendship and the enduring impact of a life well lived.